Hi, welcome to this session of Connections Online 2024. I'm Kocho-Williams. I'm coming to you from Clarkson University in Northern New York, where I'm professor of history. The point of this session this evening was to kind of have a bit of a discussion around the use of war games in teaching of history, which is something which I've been quite actively involved in. I don't have any slides. This was kind of a late added session, so I didn't have an awful lot of time to put slides together. And I was not sure that slides were necessarily very helpful. But I kind of thought that I would, think about, talking about what I did, and then we could, think about some of the games that I've used. And some of you might have already seen some of these things on X or heard me in other podcasts. And then perhaps invite questions from the audience and see where we might go. So I think kind of to begin, I guess explaining how I got here and what my approach is. So I did not start out teaching using war games. I kind of came to that I guess a kind of funny direction. I am, by background, actually a historian of late Russian imperial and early Soviet foreign policy, and that's sort of what I did my PhD in, and then that's what I have continued to pursue in my research career. But my teaching started to become a bit more diverse, and I taught for a very long time about various things in sort of these big courses, and I was reading lots and lots of student papers that were being written. But what I was getting was sort of fairly similar answers to the same sorts of questions. And I was starting to look for a way in which things could be a little bit more creative. And kind of late 2019, I had a conversation with my students and I said, how do you feel about a course that dealt with perhaps the history of World War II, but used tabletop war games as its approach? And I think, first of all, my students looked at me as if they were trying to see if I was being serious or not. But then once the penny dropped, they said, no, that would be really great. That would be interesting. And I said, okay, but here's the deal. You're going to have to get involved in coming up with some sort of design as well, because we want to talk about how wargaming communicates history, particularly to non-academic audiences, but also can be used to understand history. And so in the spring of 2020, and that was a interesting time, some of you will remember that, and we ended up going online. I launched this World War II course that I taught before, but this time using tabletop war games as the approach. And I had kind of a handful of games and limited funding, and it turned out to be a wild success, and it worked very, very well. And what I started to find was that I was teaching a group of students who were more engaged with the material than I'd had students engaged with before, and started to unpick games and use the games as a means of going down alleys and finding out things and exploring things that I couldn't have had time to deal with in class. And so they started to build with this, and they came, even through the sort of crisis of that pandemic of early 2020, they actually came back to me with a whole bunch of designs of games that communicated various aspects of World War II. And this was kind of, I guess, exciting. The proof of doing something, the proof of concept, kind of came through for me. And I was very fortunate that someone then gave me some money, which helped me build a library, but also helped me develop my own skills. And so by the fall of 2020, I was taking the Military Operations Research Society certificate in wargaming, which gave me a lot of experience, but also exposed me to particularly Sebastian Bay, who was already running things with teaching wargaming at Georgetown University, and gave me a lot of opportunity then to kind of take this further into thinking about how I could address other topics, but also how I could start to get students more and more engaged within the idea of gaming as wargaming as a means of understanding history. And so I took this, the next place I took this was World War I, then I took it to the Cold War, and all the time I was sort of building towards something to create a history course, an upper level history course in wargaming and wargame design that was really about how can we use wargames to understand history. And so I built a sort of cohort of students, and this has all been very popular. Students are really excited and enjoying this. I get lots of really, really good feedback where I have students using largely commercial war games, some of which you can see behind me. I'm sitting in my office here within my shelves, to think about how war games both present and represent history, how they can be used as tools. And one of my students famously says, this isn't a game, this is an educational tool to understand something by playing a game and thinking about what it is the game is trying to communicate, and what is the game trying to get its players to think about and to engage with. And very much in a form of, I guess, kind of experiential learning, where you have players making decisions and players being put in the positions of the protagonists or the decision makers within those games and within those historical scenarios, but putting them into things in all sorts of different scales and different positions, so different contexts. But also, are they thinking about things at a grand strategic level? Are they thinking about things at an operational level, at a tactical level? How does that differ? How do things change? How they think about things? How does one game on one subject approach something, and how does another think about it? And I think I've said before, I think with Liz Davidson, that you can take the Normandy landings as a fairly good example of the way that lots of different games will start to represent different aspects of that, and that you might have a great difference between playing something like Day of Days to playing Undaunted Normandy, to then playing something which is kind of even more sort of lower level of perhaps rolling dice, D-Day dice, or thinking about things as abstractions. And then how can you start to use games as sort of starting to think about ways to unpick things and start to approach things. So that's largely what I've done as an approach. So I got the first question here of what games have you used for your classes? And that's a really good question, because I've used lots of things, and I tend to be fairly open with students. If I have a fairly sizable library of somewhere in the region of 250 to 300 titles that I largely get them to choose from, but then we have some games that we kind of focus on in a little bit more sort of closeness. I've chosen kind of a mix of things that introduce students to a range of different levels of complexity and different levels of approaches. And so I have been a very big fan. I kind of start them out with using Battle for Moscow. One of the really good reasons for that is it's small, but also it has an online implementation that is really useful. But it also introduces them to the idea of hex and counter games, and is a really good introductory war game. The joy of the online sort of implementation is they can't set it up wrong. They can't knock it over. They can figure out and read the rules, and the system will constrain some of the things that they can and cannot do. It also handles the CRT, the combat results table, for them. And so it eases them in really nicely into a sort of sense of what games like that look like. And I'm able to put it up on a screen in front of them and say, here we go. Let me show you how this works. Let's play through it. And you can kind of tell me what you think you want to do, and I can execute things. And then I can sort of snowball from that and say, well, if you've done, Battle for Moscow, let's look at something a little bit more complicated. And if we want to stick with the Eastern Front, the kind of classic of the Russian campaign, that old the Jedko favorite, or even the reissued, now deluxe edition, starts to step into things, and students are, I understand how hex and counter games work, and I can see this, and this is getting bigger. But I also try to introduce them into sort of different types of things. So I use Undaunted Normandy a lot because it's accessible. It's a very different game. It has them very much sort of stepping into the role of tactical level decision making, but also it's kind of relatable. But I'm also a very big fan of getting them to sort of step away from the history a bit. And so I use very heavily Root, Kocho-Williams game, which is quite a serious war game, kind of sitting underneath what is cute fluffy animals in the forest. But I find that route is good because they don't try to remake decisions that have happened, and they don't get upset with the issue that things don't pan out kind of historically, and that they get to kind of think about, first of all, a game as an abstraction of something. It's not really a simulation of anything, but also then you can start to throw out sort of the idea, well, what if you took something like this and put it into a different context? What if you were to say, well, instead of this being a forest with cute fluffy animals, this is a jungle in Southeast Asia, and then pointing students towards something like Fire in the Lake, or saying, go play one of the other coin games in a series, and trying to get things to build. And so I'm kind of intentional with students, but also I find out what they get interested with. I guess to respond to some of the other comments and questions coming into the chat, there's a question here about what sort of experience, if any, with wargaming do the kids bring to the class. And that's kind of interesting because some of the students that I've now taught through several iterations have an amount of experience, but actually most of the students that come into my classes have no experience of war games whatsoever. This is the first time that they are confronted with it, and so we first of all have to kind of get into what are these about, how do they work, and I think there is that kind of, you're always trying to sort of bring new people into something. And I asked them why did they choose to take this class, and they said, well, I thought it was cool and I'd heard about things that you did, and I was hoping that I might be able to get into gaming, and this seems like a good entry point for me. But largely they have limited experience with tabletop games at all, beyond kind of maybe Sorry or Monopoly, and certainly nothing that starts to deal with things like conflict in many ways. A few of them have favorites that they have. But I think what I've learned from them is that they can be really quick studies, and that actually they can figure things out, and they'll figure things out together. But they'll also ask questions, and I find that they are often attracted by the chrome of a commercial game. They like really big boxes. They're not very interested in folio games, but they quickly learn that they sometimes are biting off more than they can chew, or more than that they have time to digest, and that perhaps the people within their classes, perhaps are interested in these things, but when they take them outside of class, their roommates may or may not be very interested or engaging. But actually, I find that actually some of them are teaching things all over campus. I find Twilight Struggle cropping up in all sorts of places in the student center. So I think kind of letting students explore these things themselves and figure things out, and come back and ask questions. And then I found kind of usefully that I've built a cohort of students who start to teach others. So I'm able to sort of seed things, and you might be looking at this subject, or I can bring in sort of student TAs in a certain way and say, well, today so and so is actually going to show you how to play this game, and they work through it, and it's been really successful, and it kind of snowballs. And I guess kind of one of the joys of teaching is actually creating a space for students to acquire knowledge, and the games offer a really good opportunity for that, because I don't have to necessarily teach them what the game is teaching. The game can do that, and I can just sort of facilitate and hold the library there. I guess the questions are, what sort of observations have surprised me or have been the sort of evergreen thoughts that have stood the test of time? I guess I've been surprised that things I thought students might have liked, they've shown no real interest in. I think that there were things I thought would be kind of great that they haven't really sort of taken to. The most obvious thing is sort of a general antithesis towards block war games. I don't really quite know why, but while I've tried to put things in front of them, they don't seem to like them. They seem to, they like the little green men of Axis and Allies, but they don't seem quite so excited by wooden blocks where they can't see what's going on, which I guess has been something of a surprise. I would have thought that things like Triumph and Tragedy and the like of them would have had an appeal that they haven't sort of seemed to have. But kind of at the same time, I've seen things that I didn't think would be perhaps so successful, or so accessible, becoming sort of real breakaway successes. And I think part of that is about letting students find things, but also that they find their comfort zone, and that they often find that they figure out how something works, and then they kind of run with it. I've found that despite offering students solitaire games, they actually really like not playing solitaire games. They like playing things with groups of other students, and they like figuring through things. But also, I guess I found that when it comes to creating their own designs, they tend to gravitate towards the creation of things with lots of cards. And I think some of that is actually that they find card-driven games really attractive and appealing, and that those kind of work for them, which I think wasn't something I necessarily expected kind of at the outset. Looking through the more questions, are there specific games I wanted to include since the initial plan was a World War II theme? I think I had some sort of ideas when I began, but a lot of what I was able to include was based on what was available, and what would sort of fit time-wise, and what wasn't too enormous. I suppose in some way, if you're going to sort of teach the meta level or the micro level of everything, Campaign for North Africa would have been great to have included, but I don't own a copy, and also I'm not sure any of my students sort of have time for it. I found that what I tried to do initially was include games into the World War II theme that covered specific theaters, but also covered the entire war. We did go with Axis and Allies, which I find somewhat problematic because students think they want to play it because it's full of little green men, and then they discover that it takes a long time to set up, and then it's more complicated than they thought it was going to be, and they thought it was kind of Risk, and it's not. But I guess I kind of have put things out there that are classics, where there's a lot of things going on. So I included Empire of the Sun to get students to think about the Japanese theater. I'm a big fan of trying to sort of get through things like Cataclysm as a sort of lightweight World at War. I would love to play World at War with my students, kind of as a semester, but it's too big. Although I have had some of them play it online, but I've been responsive to what students want to look at, and often some of them are very, very interested in something in particular, and sometimes they're interested in things that there isn't really a great deal of coverage in. You say, well, this is maybe a space for you to put things into, and to start to think about things. So I think I tried to include things. I'm Mark Herman's Churchill, and trying to get them to think about the political side of things with World War II, as well as just combat, and trying to get them to think about low-level tactical things with things like Last 100 Yards, and getting a kind of big breadth of experience, and then sort of forcing them to play different things. Question about non-tabletop war games like miniatures or RPGs. I've tried, but I guess that's sort of an end in which students have a degree of experience with RPGs a lot, with Dungeons and Dragons, and we can debate whether Dungeons and Dragons is a war game or not. I know that's kind of a hot topic, and I have tried in some classes to try to get them to think about some of the sort of smaller RPGs that have come out of people like Unruly Designs, and the Warbirds series, and then Jason Morningstar's Night Witches, in thinking about particular context, but also that those can be kind of small and discrete. Some students sort of struggle a little, I think, with the idea that I don't play D&D. That's for a kind of specific set of people, and that they're not necessarily that sort of good at role playing particular things that take them outside of their comfort zone. I'm planning this fall to try and dive a bit more into role playing games, because I'm scheduled to teach what is our freshman seminar course, which is a sort of interdisciplinary critical thinking and communication course. So I can't just have them play war games, but trying to get them to use role-playing games a bit more in that regard, to sort of push them out of their comfort zone and make them think about things from different perspectives. And I've been thinking kind of about some of the reacting to the past games, but those are sort of a little reading heavy, and I'm not sure if students will do that. But also some of the sort of Worlds of Legacy things that appear, and then actually thinking about using Blood on the Clock Tower as a kind of sort of big interactive. Doesn't matter whether students want to be particularly active or a little more passive, as a sort of supportive idea. But I think, we find, I guess, in history education at least, that students can sometimes react in challenging ways to role-playing games if they're not prepared, or if they don't feel that they're invested in it, or if they feel that they're being asked to do something which they find objectionable. And so I guess there are kind of challenges there. As to the questions of miniatures, I've tried miniatures. Students like them, but I guess the investment in miniatures is kind of heavy. And while I have had things set up on the table, I guess again there's a lot of sort of rule learning there, and they don't get sort of so involved. I think they again see these as sort of a particular kind of game that, while there's sort of lots of it out of there, there's lots of big rule books, but I think also some of them are fairly wise, that something like Warhammer or 40K is essentially a toy sales mechanism with a game sort of set up around it. I've had success, sort of not quite miniatures, but with the Pub Battles series, starting with Pub Battles Ancients and then taking them into the American Civil War, sort of as an abstraction, but without having to deal with so many miniatures, but moving things around a map in a more free-form manner does sort of seem to work for them. Moving on to the next question. Did I set formal learning objectives for the course, or was it intended to inspire more reading and research? Well, I have to set formal learning objectives for my course. It's kind of part of the setup with the syllabus, and then the ways in which we sort of try to assess, is the teaching working? And I think I found when I sort of started as well, it was sort of fitting very much with this fairly traditional ideas of what a history course does. This is to get students to understand a topic, to engage and read in a topic, and to explore something and show and demonstrate an understanding, but then sort of added into, I guess, the game thinking and the kind of systems competencies and systems thinking that comes with that. So, students will gain experience within, exposure to gaming as a methodology, and of thinking about game design as a methodology and something that they want to become involved with. And it's sort of becomes the reading and research as an inspiration becomes a bonus on that. How many students have cycled through the program? So I have to do a bit of mental arithmetic here, but I guess we would be kind of thinking, so from 2020, and some of the students have been sort of the same examples, the same students going through. But I would be looking at somewhere between 150 and 200 students thus far, having cycled through the program since the spring of 2020. Which I guess we're a small university, that would represent a fairly sizable quotient of students taking history courses. Often as part of general education requirements, sometimes as part of their major. But I see, sometimes I see the same faces, and sometimes I see lots of new faces, which is one of the exciting things about teaching. But I would say probably we're in the 150 to 200, which is 150 to 200 students more than were exposed to it before I started doing this. So it's become kind of exciting and programmatic. and in kind of getting students, it's sort of snowballed as well. That students are now telling me they all want to get into my courses. It's they're some of the fastest courses to fill, and they have long waiting lists, and they're sort of the talk of campus. I think not because they're easy, but because they're fun, and because they're engaging and interesting. Is there a specific aha moment? Yeah, well, I don't know if there's a specific aha moment, or if there are lots of specific aha moments that I haven't got from traditional coursework. Some of it is when students tell me this rule book is terrible. Are they all like this? And I think there is kind of one of the things they learn from this is that actually sometimes writing the things to communicate how you make it work can be a little challenging, and sometimes things don't work. And so thinking about how do you explain it, how do you teach something, how do you create a guide for someone to interact. But I think some of the things that I've really found in teaching is getting students to decouple themselves from thinking about winning and losing, and to think about the journey and what it's teaching them. And I try to tell students, I know you want to win, but it doesn't necessarily matter so much. But also getting students to think about why certain things may or may not have happened, and that you present them with, here is a game. You know what happened historically, or at least you know what happened in the big picture historically. But how can this game kind of help you unpick that, get you to think about it in different ways, take you through different ideas about things? Can you arrive at the same general outcome even if you take a different route? Do you end up with a completely different outcome because something happens by chance? And then how does that match with what you think you understand as the history? And I think the kind of what I find with the students is that they get themselves very involved through playing games, and they get very invested in thinking about what's going on, trying to think about what strategies might be, why certain things were constrained in ways that they were, how you deal with how did you get to this point. And I think I've had a lot of students who have turned around to me and said, so the reason that this actually happened is because something worked out that might not have done, or something else could have ended up as a sort of different different outcome. Or that they said, well, I had never really been aware of the fact that there was this really small element of something that was contributing to a larger story. That wasn't what I was taught. There's a really good example, and actually David Thompson came and talked to my class last fall about his design of Lanzerath Ridge as part of the Battle of the Bulge, and students saying, wow, I hadn't really thought about the fact that the Battle of the Bulge actually has lots of smaller components, and you could think about this, and then does it matter if the outcome on this small component is different or not? I think I've also had the kind of aha moments with students where you can present them with something that's really large and say, well, what's the challenge here? And I actually had a group of students playing Time for Trumpets, but I had them split up, and I said, well, you're actually now facing the same problem that the people commanding this on the ground in late 1944, early 1945 are experiencing, the fact that you don't all know what each other are thinking, and you're trying to communicate, and there's lots of things going on, and you're trying to unpick this, but you also have no idea what the outcome might be here until you play it through. And I think what I've seen with students is that they're able to start to question things in ways they wouldn't do if they were just reading, or if they were engaging with a source, and that students are very much approaching games as source material. And I'm very blunt with them that there are some games out there where actually the research for the game is better than some of the research in the books or in the movies, and the game gives them a space to play around sometimes with thinking through something in a way that a narrative account or an analytical account doesn't always let them do. You've got something that's kind of very linear, and games are not, while they do tend to have a linear unfolding, they're not necessarily linear in the way that they happen. And then I get students to write me after action reports. How did the game, what did it do? How did it work? Were you successful? Were there challenges? Were there things you would do differently? And I think that sort of then ties the practice of using war games to teach history into the practice of using professional war games in professional settings, be that the military or business or other areas, to kind of push them to think about how they could use this beyond just the confines of the 14 weeks that I teach them for a course. Got a question of how sticky has gaming become for the students? Are they still gaming after the course, or are they less proactive about finding something to play without it being assigned? So this was something where I've been actively surveying my students after the fact, and I found that I've had lots of students who've come to me as non-gamers who are now very active gamers, and are still gaming beyond the confines of the course. They have taken what they've got and they got really excited with things. One of the ways that I know that this is going on is because I keep this library, and you can see some of it behind me, and students come and borrow things from me, and they come and ask, I want to play something with something, or I think my roommates might like to play something with me. And I think one of the great things about this is it's been kind of infectious. So it's not just been that students have continued to wargame after the course, they're taking wargaming beyond my classes to other students, and playing lots of things. And I'm finding that students are telling me that they bought certain things because they wanted to play them. Of course, some of these can be very expensive. And that really I sort of seem to have developed alongside my teaching, or a societal sort of element of thinking sort of about how games can be used and how they're interesting and how they're engaging. I think students also have found that games are a really good outlet for them. We're largely a technological university, and so games give them a kind of a space. And I hear this a lot from students that this gives them space to kind of think about things, and so they have been pretty good about finding things and playing things, and I seem to have turned our ROTC detachment into very serious wargamers with students that I've taught. But now that they're borrowing lots of games from me and playing them within their detachment, which I think is great for the approach, but also great for just getting more people playing war games. The question of would students after action reports, do any of them want to submit them for publication? I can ask them for you, or for your friend. I haven't really kind of approached getting students to think about them as things that they might publish. But I think certainly some of them might be keen to do so. So I could certainly push things in that direction. Many of them are more interested in thinking about whether they can take their prototypes towards publication. I've got a couple of students from last fall's wargaming class working with commercial publishers with games, and I got a group of students who presented a game prototype this morning, in fact, who are very keen to pursue commercial publication. But I can certainly I can see if they want to publish after action reports. Perhaps they do. The question of do I tie comparison and contrast over time of different games and approaches? Yes, and I do try to get them to think about how games have evolved, but also to try to think about how sometimes games have evolved because our understanding of subject matter has evolved, as well as the fact that our the approaches of games have evolved as well. And I guess we can throw very traditional things at them, and then we can start to throw things that are a little more recent or different approaches, and I quite keen to have them think about what changes once card driven games start to become more prevalent, what happens when Eurogames start to have an influence on wargaming as a design. And some of this then gets them to think about how do we conceptualize what a wargame is, which is always a sticky question. What is and isn't a wargame. Hardened grogs, or if it's not hex and counter, then it's not a wargame. But I think there's a lot of space, and I think I'm often a little fluid about what does and doesn't constitute a war game. I think it has to include some form of conflict as sort of its key underpinning things. But there's a lot of space in there to think about, different times and approaches. But I also get them to think about, different approaches and what are different kinds of things trying to do. That you can be very granular with a hex and counter tactical game. You can think about things that are bigger with strategic scale, but also you can start to say, well, what if we did this and we want to talk about it as not hex and counter, or if we think about there's hidden movement, and there's a lot of scope in teaching this to also teach them about the history of game development and of the industry. And I have somewhere this wonderful poster that came out with C3I magazine that sort of shows a whole bunch of sort of key games through various decades of development in various different eras. But also I try to get them to think about, well, where can you start to see the commonalities of approach of games that start to actually think about different periods of time that are largely the same system but doing sort of different things. The Coin series is very good for that, I find, with them, because you can say, well, here's a game about Rome and the Gallic Wars, and it kind of fits into the same system as that you're playing through with insurgency in Vietnam, the Cuban Revolution, or even things that start to spill into science fiction. I guess getting them into sort of the commonalities of approach, but also then where do you start to find distinctions, and how does that start to inform their own design thinking? Becomes kind of really sort of important. It'll be really interesting to see a before and after contrast to what the students think a wargame is before and after. I actually asked them in class 1, what do they think a wargame is, and a whole bunch of I get them to do this with sticky notes, and I get them, write things down, and then I take those away from them on a big sheet of paper, and we come back at the end of class. I said, well, this is where we started. Let's see if you still think what you think you thought. And quite a lot of them actually, when they're non-warming games, they sort of come in and they go, I don't actually really know it's a game about war. By the time we sort of finish, they probably have lots of ideas about what war games are and what kind of the central things are. They all become pretty clear that chess is essentially a war game, and that things like Go are essentially war games, albeit abstractions of things. But then they sort of get into where there is conflict of some form at the core of it, and often common elements of things, but that perhaps something like Scythe is not a war game because actually really it's an engine building game that has combat, but that's not its central theme, and that just mere competition is not enough. It does not make Monopoly a war game, but actually thinking about war as a theme or conflict as a theme that governs the central mechanics tends to be where they end up. But I think there's a lot of sort of things that we start to inform them. I probably start to see myself in that space, because students will come and ask me, could I play this? Is this a war game? And I said, well, tell me whether it is or it isn't. And I'm open to be convinced, but I'm not sure that building Rube Goldberg machines to catch plastic mice is a war game, even if you don't like the mice, and your aim is to trap the mice. But perhaps something else that we might think about is different. I don't think students will look at things like votes for women, which, as far as I'm concerned, is very much a war game, and say, but it's not really about war. And so, well, it's about conflict, isn't it? And it uses all of the mechanics that come from wargaming. And I think it does become this sort of important thing of thinking with students about war games about the intersection of themes and format and mechanics, and what they're trying to use and what they're trying to present things, and that they're there for other things. I think with more time, the more students I get, the more sort of shift of sense of what war games are might become sort of clearer as sort of the break. But going from sort of zero to now I understand what these are has clearly been something I've experienced. Are other faculty members interested in pursuing the integration of war games? I get contacted by people fairly regularly who tell me that they're aware of what I'm doing and that it would be interesting. And I've presented at the American Historical Association, and featured on a number of podcasts, including the mentioned in Dispatches with the Armchair Dragoons, who've organized connections. And I think there is very much a sort of a building sort of cohort of people starting to dip their toes into this. And my colleagues within Clarkson are, some of them are interested, and some of them say, well, could you bring something into my classes? Could we do something in Roman warfare? Could you bring something in that deals with the Punic Wars, or deals with Rome? But I think there is sort of more and more students are starting, students are showing interest, and more faculty are starting to ask about how they might integrate wargaming into their teaching. And I think kind of the biggest success was a couple of weeks ago, as I was wheeling my cart off to class. I happened to bump into one of our aeronautical engineering faculty who said, I keep hearing about this from my students and it sounds really interesting. What could we do in my teaching that you could bring into class? I said, well, tell me about what you're teaching. He said, well, I teach students about kind of some of the history of aviation, and some of that involves warplanes. I was like, well, let's have a conversation about what we could bring in as aviation-based war games, into your space, so you've got students to start to think about things. And I brought in Wings for the Baron into his class. Students really sunk their teeth into that, of sort of the development track of things, and I think there is my classes are very full. People are thinking about what is exciting, and how could they start to use some of these things across curriculum, and where does a history professor suddenly have something really exciting to teach something else, and air warfare has been one of those. I've also been engaging with our environmental side of things, our Institute for the Sustainable Environment, where I came in and ran some matrix games with people there to think about an approach there that could be used to get people to think about environmental concerns, but also have started to sort of facilitate various things and say, look, these things aren't necessary. You don't have to think this is all necessarily bombs and bullets. We can start to think about some of the other areas of conflict, and that's been very successful, I think, in sort of moving things forwards. And I guess things tend to snowball. I had a conversation with our provost yesterday, where the provost came and said to me, like, I keep hearing about all these things you're doing. Let's run a wargaming weekend for the campus community, and maybe have some some sort of tournament play where students can get involved in things and win prizes, and it could be exciting, and faculty could play as well, and then faculty could see about how they could maybe use some of these things in terms of where they might go in their teaching, even if they're not trying to teach history, but where these things might be useful, but also that games become things that students get excited about, and they become outlets for them. So I think it's an ongoing conversation within the campus. We're small, which is, I guess, kind of nice. Everybody knows who I am and where to find me on campus, and lots of faculty have been borrowing games from the library as well. So I guess people have been thinking about things, and my political science colleagues have been taking playing things with students like 1960 over the making of the president. No one has borrowed Mr. President from me yet. but also, starting to think about how they could model things and use games as sort of an exciting way. And I think one of the reasons there is that, it's in the chat, I have this incredible student demand for what I'm doing, which means the students really like it, and other people want to know how they can get such good enrollments, particularly, I guess, in an era where, in the approach of history, teaching history, almost every day we hear about yet another college shutting down its humanities and job losses, and I think proving to people within what is a STEM institution that there's lots of exciting things that can be done, and that this is experiential learning in history, and exciting, and there's a design and entrepreneurial component to it, but that also this is really fostering deep learning. And I find that faculty have been really receptive to that, but also faculty are pointing students in my direction. So you want to go take his courses. These are things I think you're going to get a lot out of, and the students are kind of beating down my door. I only have so many games and only so many hours in the week. But yeah, I guess the more I keep doing this, the more it starts to sort of build through things. So I'm looking at it. Given the way my class is structured, it seems games are reinforcing other matter rather than the underlying topic. So that's how I started, and that was sort of the beginning of the approach. And I guess part of that was that when I began with this, I didn't really know very much about game design myself, and I hadn't really sort of taken things very much in that direction. That began to change for me when I took the MORS, the Military Operations Society certificate in wargaming, and I encountered, it was virtual, it was the fall of 2020, but I encountered Sebastian Bay, who I guess some people have talked about as the Taylor Swift of wargaming, and I know Sebastian often says that it seems crazy, but Sebastian became a huge inspiration for me, because he was already doing things at that point at Georgetown University with a graduate course in which he was teaching wargaming and thinking about wargame design, and he still does that. And then I sort of encountered Rex Brynan and his approach at McGill, and McGill's actually really close to me. It's less than a 2-hour drive, and I think really with that MORS course, I really found that I had avenues that I could start to develop, and avenues that I could draw on from that to take people into better understandings of wargaming as a methodology and a subject matter, but also to thinking about design. And one of the great things in that course is that by the time you get to the end of it, it's a brilliant course. If you have the opportunity to take it, I really recommend it. That takes you through kind of the nuts and bolts of design and thinking about things, and the hows and whys of everything. And there's some really great instructors on that. I was fortunate enough that Peter Perler was still alive at the time and taught on it, but there's lots of people. Ed McGrady who was running it at the time. Was Betsy Jocelyn is teaching on it. Sebastian Bay. You'll be exposed to kind of some of the great minds of contemporary wargame design, thinking through it, and that was really helpful to me. And I took some of what Sebastian was doing, and Sebastian connected me into the Educational Wargaming collective, and sort of brought me sort of even further into things. And there was very clear ways in which I could start to build, not just using games as a reinforcement of the topic, but actually a way to get students to think about designing games and designing things more comprehensively. And I sort of brought that to fruition, I guess, last fall when I launched my course History 420, which I think was maybe not about what students thought it was about when I called it 420, but was wargaming. And that's a course that kind of, I guess, flipped the approach of using games to understand a particular historical topic. And I said to students, look, I'm not going to teach you history here, and actually to start thinking about teaching them focused game design. and some of that borrowed from ideas that Sebastian had, and borrowed from ideas that Rex Brynan had, and others, as a means of kind of throwing students into, we have 14 weeks and we might be starting from you having no experience of game design, but you're going to come out of this at the far end having presented to me and the rest of the class, and having recorded it and shoved it on the internet, you presenting and playing through a functioning game design prototype that communicates a particular historical topic or subject. And so I got into teaching game design last fall. I'm running it again this coming fall. It was the first course to fill up on campus, which is pretty impressive. And I could probably teach 3 times the number of students I can take based on my wait list. My wait list is bigger than my class enrollment because the room is full. And so I have students who are excited to get into the creativity of game design, but also to unpicking games and sort of thinking about and approaching a topic. And so last fall I had a group of 30 students who split themselves into groups as early as 3 weeks into the semester, when I made them pitch ideas and see if they could get traction. And I probably had about a dozen or so ideas, and we got down to 7 game designs that ranged from the Emu Wars of the early 1930s through to electoral politics in the 1980s, to a future civil war in northern New York fought between deer and coyotes, which riffed kind of off North Korean propaganda to some extent, and within that I brought in a raft of really excellent guest speakers who came and fleshed out things for me and exposed students to different things. So Kocho-Williams came in and talked about his approaches to game design, a lot about root and then a lot about the industry. Volker Runke came and talked about his approach to game design, and particularly with the coin system. David Thompson came and talked about his approach to designing Lanzerath Ridge. And suddenly I had lots of students who really wanted to play David Thompson's games and think about the Valiant Defense series. Kevin Bertram came and talked about having designed Shores of Tripoli, but also running Fort Circle games and things, and was very open about some of the economics of war game design in the industry. And I'm trying to think who else came in. Jason Matthews came and talked about his designs, and this was kind of great and exciting, and I'm hoping I'll get more guest speakers in this fall. Perhaps if anyone wants to volunteer to speak to my students, I think that would be exciting and a good opportunity. I'm very much hoping. I discovered during the course of this semester that although I guess maybe isn't a war game, it deals with some of the things with deception, that Brenda Romero, who designed the game Train, in fact is an alumna of Clarkson, and so I'm told that she has talked to some of the graphic design and digital design people before, so I'm hoping she might decide that she wants to come and speak to students at her alma mater about game design. But I really found that students really they engaged really fiercely with wanting to do design. I discovered that some of my students are incredibly talented artists, or some of them have incredible CAD skills, and some of them are computer scientists who are actually capable of creating an entire design prototype in Vassal or Tabletop Simulator or programming things. I've got a student presenting on Tuesday who's created an entire digital implementation of a game, and so I see a lot of strengths coming out of students. But also, I'm hoping that we might be seeing some of the newer generation of game designers appearing through this as well. And I think there's been a lot of satisfaction from the students, and a lot of it's so great to see students get excited about things. And so teaching game design as a historian rather than as a game designer has been really rewarding and really exciting, and students have really got into it. All questions have been answered.
Yeah, that covers it. I'm going to take us off stream, but thank you so much for joining us on Connections Online.
Well, thank you for having me on.